Okay. Oh shit. All right. Okay. Here we go. Hello and welcome to SnarkSquad Pod, the media podcast where we have a lot of feelings but don't know where they came from. My name is Nicole Sweeney.
I am Marines.
And we are joined again by our friend Chelsea. Chelsea, say hello, reintroduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Chelsea. I am co-host of the Not Now I'm Reading podcast and also a very rare and occasional booktuber and constant Twitter presence. So, hi, guys.
Hello. So Chelsea is here with something that she picked this time. We wanted to have Chelsea back on the podcast, and we were just like, so pick a book.
And we'll read it.
Yeah, we'll read it. Much like the last time that Chelsea was here, we actually prefaced this conversation. I guess it was the other way around. We did book, and then we talked about adaptations, and then the movie. I forget the sequence of events. But last week's topic on fandom, we decided to have that conversation in part because we knew that today we were going to be talking about Eliza and her monsters, and fandom was a thing that we were kind of going to talk about eventually anyway. So this seemed like a good fit, a good 1-2 punch. And so I am going to throw it back to Chelsea now to explain the plot of this book.
Okay. God, I hate this thing. I always hate plots. And I hated it last time you guys made me do it too, but it's okay. Eliza and Her Monsters by Francesca Zappia is the story of Eliza Merk. Eliza Merk is shy and anxious and going through high school trying to blend in as much as possible, while at the same time living her life online as one of the most well-known and beloved content creators of a webcomic called Monstrous Sea. Think Check Please, or the kind of huge Tumblr ongoing serial postings. So she's balancing these two aspects of her life, and then one day into her English class walks Wallace. And Wallace is big and bumbly and literally does not speak. And one day it comes to her attention that Wallace is also one of the biggest fan fiction writers in the fandom that she has created. So they are both living this double life. She knows about Wallace's fan fiction, but Wallace does not know that Eliza is the creator of this webcomic that he is so in love with. So it is the story of Eliza and Wallace's relationship and friendship, and also Eliza balancing being online and being in real life and being a creator. Her parents do some very well-intentioned but unfortunate things, and so then Eliza kind of has to deal with the process of becoming known to the world, and that leads her down some different kind of pathways that she has to deal with. And at the end, you just kind of are left. I was left with the warm fuzzies. When the ladies asked me to pick this book, I immediately knew that I wanted to read this one because this was my favorite book of 2017. This has been my evangelize book. This is the book that I've been handing to every single person, just being just read it. Just come back and see me in a day after you read it. I love it so much. So I'm really excited to hear what you guys thought.
Well, I guess normally we do did you like this? But that's the answer to that. So I guess I'll kick that over to Mari then.
Yeah, that's my official answer. I mean, since I picked it, it's probably a fair assumption. I loved this book.
I did. I liked this a lot. I was so surprised by how damn readable it is. There's something very, very just addictive and smooth about the entire experience, so that I was reading entire chunks without, I would look up and I'd be like, oh, I just read another 80 pages. Wow. So it was very, very addictive. I loved Eliza. I loved the characters. I really liked a lot of the themes. I think I had minor quibbles with a few things, but overall, I don't have a lot of negative to say about this. So yeah, thanks for making me read this. I really enjoyed it.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I would echo basically everything that you just said. I also thoroughly enjoyed this. I also found that I read in much larger chunks than I intended. I sat down planning to read a certain amount and then would read a bunch more than that. I struggled a little bit in the beginning. It was a little bit of a slow start. I just realized that I forgot to pull it up, but there was something very early on that was like the like most basic of YA heroine introductions that like made me eye roll to the point that I stopped and took a picture of it, but now I can't find it, so I don't remember even what it was. But it was your standard like, I'm plain, but like I think I'm plain, but probably I'm pretty, like nothing type thing. And I was like, oh no, what are we doing? And I was very worried at first, but then like once I got over that, there were a number of things actually about the introduction that I had one sort of feeling about, but that ultimately sort of sold me by the end. I guess that is like that's more just like a minor quibble. That wasn't something that I came back around on, but I think one of the things that won me over very early on that was like I had this immediate reaction of like, oh my God, this kid is like such a brat to her parents. And then by about, I don't know, maybe 50, 60 pages in, like that was like the moment that I was like, oh, I was such a brat to my parents.
Yeah, the minute you start to like sympathize with the YA heroine, you're like, oh.
Yeah.
The scene where her parents like take away her phone on the camping trip, I literally was like, I'm 30, no one takes my phone away anymore, but I was still like, I'm so mad. Like, you don't do that to somebody. Like,
how dare you?
How dare you? And I'm like sitting here with my phone in my hand, like as an adult, being like, how rude.
I think even this stuff like at the beginning that I think the author does a lot of this where it seems like it's tropey, but then it becomes a little bit deeper. So even the stuff where she's like, I'm so plain and I'm so whatever, that later becomes this thing. She has a line about how my body is not a thing that I'm burdened with. Like I don't have to carry it around that way. Mm-hmm. And it just because you really get to see like more of her inner thoughts and it becomes a bit of a, instead of just like I'm plain and boys don't like me, it really is something that she's struggling with, like being in her own skin and carrying around her body. So a lot of the introductory things are like, ooh, what are you doing? What are you doing? And then she and like you keep reading and you're like, yeah, okay, I like this.
And she does a lot of those like little flips. My favorite one is the example of when, because Wallace comes and he's this very big guy, right? Like he's described as like linebacker, football player, like big dude. And there's this scene where he's literally getting like bullied basically, or like kind of harassed by these two guys in school because he's trying to write his like fan fiction. And Eliza comes up and, which I should probably preface this by saying fan fiction and fandom spaces are usually relegated to like a female domain, and they're usually kind of castigated and dismissed as something that's lesser because of that. And so in this kind of book, you have this kind of stereotypical quote unquote masculine, like alpha male looking kind of dude who's not only engaging in this more feminized activity and getting a lot of shit for it, but then you have this girl who is so much struggling with like disappearing and feeling like she just has to constantly kind of curl in on herself, who stands up for him and who comes out and who kind of like shuts that shit down. And then he later does that for her. But there's a lot of those little kind of moments of like you were saying, kind of subverting those tropes or expectations that I was just like, and you almost don't even realize it till after you're reading. And then you're like, hey, Francesca, that was a cool thing you did. Like I saw that there. I liked that.
Well done.
I'm really glad that you brought up the fact of it being kind of a like looked down upon for being traditionally feminine and in like kind of the way that it is received, and like mostly because it is not something that we talked about at all when we were talking about this stuff in the last episode. And like, I think that's one of the things that is really cool about doing this in this kind of 1-2 way is that, you know, like all of the threads that we didn't get into, we can sort of also kind of weave into this conversation. So that's really cool. And I agree. I very much enjoyed that component of it. Also in the way of sort of things that got flipped. This is sort of related to the thing about her being a brat, but something that is also like a huge piece of this story, but like there were things about her also very, very early on when I was kind of like, I don't know about this book, where I felt like it was like it didn't feel. It felt believable, but not especially engaging in this way. Like I was like, I don't know, maybe I would have enjoyed this more if I were 16 or 17 reading it, like that kind of thing. But even those moments that I felt sort of disengaged, I like came to love that because like when you get to kind of, you know, midway, I guess the back half of the book where we start wrestling with her depression, and that like that has been a thing throughout. That was another one of those things that was like, oh yes, okay, like all of the things at the beginning that were making me feel a certain kind of way, her selfishness is also kind of part of that. And I don't know, I don't want to, I feel slightly concerned when I say that's coming across as like a judgment, and I don't mean for it to. Like, I say this as somebody who also struggles with a lot of mental health stuff, but like there is like that inward focusing, like that you have a really, really hard time properly understanding like the complexity of everyone else around you when you're kind of like deep in the mess of that. And so some of the things about her that I found grating very early on were things that came back around for me when became clear that this was also very much a book about mental health. And that was something that I really deeply appreciated.
Which is probably a good time to give like a small trigger warning. There is talk of depression and anxiety, and also some suicidal ideation and mention of past character suicide that takes place in this book. So apologies if you find that to be like spoilery in any way, but I think it's more important to probably give that shout out.
Yeah.
Foolishly at the beginning, in my haste to get as many people to read this as possible, I was recommending this book without giving that trigger warning. And that's something I want to make sure that I do this time, because it is like a thing that the latter like third of the book spends time kind of like wrestling through really effectively. I thought in a really like good way, but it's definitely there.
I want to briefly jump back so we don't lose it, because I want to make sure to make this point. But in the part about like fan fiction being like coded as a girly or like a female thing, I think there was a really interesting line of comparison that she does subtly throughout the book, and it's between all of the online and fandom stuff that Eliza is doing and the sports that her younger brothers are doing. And I think it's just really interesting because when you think of fans, you think of like the screaming fangirls and how that's looked down upon, but if you're doing it in a stadium and it's a boy, it's like okay. So like the sports fan, that's fine, but like the fangirl, no thank you. And she draws this comparison a couple of times. Even her therapist kind of tells her about like sports and art and how like you can view those different things that way. And I thought that was just really smart and like a good way to look like, hey, you know, some people will do this sport thing and that's good for them, and some people like creating things online and that's good for them. And so that was like a thread that I really enjoyed. And then on the topic of Eliza and her mental health, I was 100% there with you too. I think a big portion of whether or not you will enjoy this book depends on whether you can empathize with Eliza. She definitely, for a portion of her book, I think, you know, she does kind of annoy you sometimes with her decision or the way that she treats those that love her. But as you start to understand her headspace better, I found that I empathized with her a lot. And I think that a big portion of her story is just that she has all of this anxiety and she has this depression or whatever she's going to, and she didn't learn how to deal with it. She's been funneling it into this one medium. Mm-hmm. And so like the way that starts breaking down is essentially her story. And so if you don't understand that or if you don't relate to it, I guess that can be kind of a miss for you here. But that is kind of the point. She cannot relate with others outside of her. She has trouble communicating with them. She you know, she's very focused internally, and she's funneling all of her emotions and her problems into this art. So yes, that is the thing about her, but that is the story at the end of the day.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Well, because she's like a young adult protagonist, right? And she's like an actual teenage protagonist. She's not one of these like Dawson's Creek teenagers who's actually like 30. Like she's like kind of a brat, and she's kind of shitty to her parents in a way that comes back to bite her in the ass. And not like intentionally, but just because she's a teenager and she's bad at communicating and she's selfish in the way that she's like wrapped up in all of her own shit. And granted, her problems are a little outside the norm because she's got this like huge, massive online creative fandom that she's basically built around herself, and the pressures of that come into play for her. But like at the end of the day, she's just like a teenager who, like you said, has had this one coping skill, and then her one coping skill just gets like blown the fuck up, and she doesn't have, which like I've been there. I remember the first time I learned that like my primary coping skill wasn't going to function anymore, so I had to like figure it out. Luckily, I wasn't 18, so I wasn't also dealing with like all the things of being 18. But like and I just really like the foils between Eliza and Wallace and the way that they both handle like similar mental health things. And I just really like this book, you guys. It's so good.
Yeah, but there was a lot to enjoy here. I found Eliza just so deeply relatable. Like, in spite of having like a different set of experiences, obviously, like I was not the creator of a wildly successful webcomic as a teenager. There were just so many things about her that I was like, oh God, like this is everything about this. I felt just a deep sense of, I don't know, kinship and connection with like my teenage self. I think another thing that I would say is very different is that my parents like were much better about getting it, like getting the thing that I was doing. And that was another thing too, that like I mentioned last week, like the forum website thing that I started, and like my parents were like much more into it. Like they thought it was really cool. They were really excited about it. Like they helped me, set up the, domain and hosting and like that kind of stuff. Like they paid for that. And so like I needed, like quite literally needed their buy-in, and like they were on board and whatever. And so like, and that piece of it was also just really interesting to me too, to see, I don't know, just the difference, like to see like what the shift that like her parents clearly loved her very, very much. Like that much is evident, and it's not a lack of love. But going back to what Mari was saying about sort of the distinctions that Zappia draws between like the sports stuff and then like kind of other kinds of fanish activity, like you see just how disconnected her parents are, and like just like that was frustrating. Like, and I don't know. I liked the fact that both Eliza and her parents were right and wrong. Like this breakdown in that relationship. It felt in the beginning like it was just as simple as Eliza is being kind of bratty and shutting them out, and like that's the problem. But like also there is like a clear, like they're not. Like her younger brother, when he has the, his whole big sort of speech to them, like they were not putting in much effort
like they
at
didn't
all.
really care.
Like when he's like, you could have just fucking Googled it. Like you never, in the years that she's been doing this, it never occurred to you to like Google
Which
it?
I love that scene. The scene when her two younger brothers sit everybody in the family down and are like, all right, mom and dad, like take a fucking number. We're going to talk about what exactly is going on here, and just like lay out everything for her. Because like, yes, obviously Eliza is being super teenage dumb by not just like fucking talking to her parents, but also like, her parents have not given her a ton of indications that they're like super into talking about her webcomic. Like, so to have both of them, and especially because he's like, you guys heard my Charles Murray love. You guys know I love younger brothers. You know how I feel about a good dirty younger brother. And there were two of them in this book. Plus, okay, their names are like Sullivan and Churchill. And I just like, what dorky names for two little sports boys. I love them.
I also, on the thing with her parents too, like even when they're like, okay, you're shutting us out, there's just no effort to meet her where she is. Their solution to that is like, we're going to take away all your technology and force you to come into the woods with us.
Right.
Like there's like the complete lack of effort on their part. So I don't know, like that whole dynamic of, I say this starting the book from this very, I am an adult reading this YA novel, and you have that experience of, oh, I'm an adult now because I identify with this character. Having that experience, but then also being able to be like, no, okay, but here's all the stupid decisions the adults also made.
I think the reason that I like lean toward Eliza's side a little bit here is just because the ability to put words to what you're feeling is something that you learn across a lifetime. And the fact that it wasn't always necessarily that she didn't want to talk to them about it, but there were a lot of things that she just could not express. And I felt that frustration in her, and I really saw it coming across the page where you really understood that she didn't have the words to express what she was feeling, first of all, like mental health wise, why it was important in her to her, especially because they were starting at this place of like they didn't even get what it was that she was doing. So for her to then explain the importance of it, they were just completely at different ends. And so that's why I think that it wasn't, I felt more for Eliza. And it made me really think for the people who are coming to this story, at what point there is a disconnect for the reader, because I, as a millennial who didn't necessarily grow up with this technology but came into it, I remember getting our first computer. I remember buying my first cell phone. So we're not natives to a lot of this technology. So we had a lot of this where we were coming into these spaces and these spheres and these fandoms, and our parents didn't get it. So I wonder what the next generation cutoff is, where they're like, what do you mean? Like, we'll get
Why
it for
are
our
parents so fucking oblivious?
Right.
It's just like, I'm an adult, but there are still times when my mom will and then granted, I'm trying to get better because we all should, but where my mom was like, why is your face always in the phone? And I'm like, she doesn't understand that this is not only how I conduct my actual work that gives me money, but my social life and so many of my actual important emotional connections take place in a digital space. Right. And that doesn't invalidate them. They just don't understand. Whereas I would never ask my niece that. My niece is 14 and I would never I would never think to question that aspect of her life, or to try and diminish or in some way kind of side eye that, just knowing that she's already coming up into that. But then I wonder what Mary was saying, what the next thing will be, because there's always a disconnect, right? Intergenerationally, there's always some disconnect. So one day my niece is going to do something fucking crazy and I'm going to go, what are you doing with this thing in your life? What is happening? So it just is a matter of what the thing is. But that, I think that's why I can partially sympathize with Eliza, because I am an introvert. So much of my life is conducted online that to have people then kind of be like, well, just take your face out of your phone and live real life. Yeah. And I'm like, bitch, part of my real life is in my phone. What are you talking about?
I mean, this is a podcast started by two friends who met online, so.
Yeah. That's the real life is not in your phone or on the internet or whatever. That's, there's too many words. There's too many words.
Well, it's crazy. Because Kay is my podcast host. We met on the internet. She's my best friend and now lives in the guest room in my house. And you would be shocked how many of my family were like, you met her on the internet. She was going to single white female me and show up and be some 500-pound guy that I'd never seen before in my entire life. I'm like, I've seen her face. I've seen her talking with her mouth moving and words. Right. I know this. So it's just, again, it's that whole disconnect of generational stuff. And then again, also Eliza's parents aren't really trying. Right. They try one time and then they're like, oh, well, we don't get it. So go do your little thing and have fun, sweetie. But bye, go do it over there. We're going to be over here.
This is another place where I think part of it is that reading this book just made me very appreciative of my own parents. I think about the intergenerational stuff and everything that you were saying about we remember the moments of the fears as we were growing up with this stuff. And I met my first internet friend when I was 11. My parents knew this was, I was too, I was, again, I needed my parents' buy-in. We needed to be having these conversations, whatever. And this was me and another 11-year-old little girl who also lived in Southern California, not that far away from me. Her mom brought her to a play that I was in and so that we could meet. And then we went to Six Flags and whatever. And I don't know, this was just, I was homeschooled for a little while. And so my mom was like, all right, well, I guess you're not seeing kids in life. So I guess this is where you're making friends now, question mark.
Oh, sweetie, that's so precious. I was literally ASLing my way all up and down the internet chat rooms, from East Coast to West Coast, but it didn't matter. I was the poster child for internet stranger danger, but I'm still alive, so it's fine, guys. Don't worry about it. Nothing too bad happened. It's fine.
Lived to tell the tale.
I had the probably exact opposite experience. My parents were probably a lot like Eliza's parents in that I don't even know if they know that I have a YouTube channel. If they're listening to this, I didn't share it with them.
My mom knows I have a podcast, but every time I remind her, she's like, what's that? And I'm like, okay.
Bye, Mom.
Internet radio, Ma. Don't worry about it.
We swear we're all adults here.
profesh to death.
Another aspect of like her creating online that I really wanted to talk to was around her being anonymous and then being revealed, and then just all of her anxiety over creating a thing and putting it out online, because it gave me all of the feelings as someone who started blogging online under a pen name anonymously. And like, it was like a huge deal for me to put my real name online for a lot of like the anxiety that Eliza has in this. I just thought that that whole piece of it was smart to include in the story, and then very well handled, especially because it had that foil of the author that she loved, and you know how she didn't finish that series of books, and just the responsibility to fans when you are a creator. And then, you know, she's 18 or however old she is, 17 or 18, and she's dealing with all of that pressure and that responsibility.
And I think, I mean, in an age when we're literally, when crybabies are launching 400,000 like $1 million petitions to get Star Wars remade and whatever their ideal image is, as opposed to just writing some goddamn fandom like they're fucking fan fiction like the rest of us have had to do for forever. Mm-hmm. Yep. There's very much so right now this idea of like, quote unquote fan service versus being quote true to yourself as a creator versus the way we handle expectations from like stars and discourse. Like I thought it was really interesting having everything, like it was very present in my mind when we were doing the rereading the recent kind of chase off of Kelly Marie Tran off of social media by these like fuckheads. And so I was reading after Eliza's name is like presented to the school, how people like look at her and talk to her and expect things from her. And she realized that her English teacher has this like tattoo of this thing she's created, which like is complimentary, but also like, whoa, hella pressure and like weird that somebody had like put that on their body. And so it's like, it's this very interesting kind of exploration on a smaller scale, because she's still in high school, of like how we interact with creators, both like respectfully and not respectfully, and like all of the expectations that they can feel and that we can put on them. And like, I've written my like a little tiny bit of fanfic, but nobody's fucking over here reading my Boy Meets World fanfic published 2 decades later. Like nobody's expecting that to be finished.
I am about to.
I will DM you links later. I wish I was kidding. But so I can't even imagine to have that much additional like pressure. It's no wonder to me the way that it all happens, that's what sparks Eliza off down her kind of even further spiral. Like Eliza's not doing super great mentally throughout like a large portion of this book.
But having those boundaries, like that is the thing. Like she had boundaries at least. So even though she wasn't doing great, like at least when it came to this enormous piece of her life, she had those boundaries to protect her from all of that shit. You mentioned the teacher, and I just like, that is totally, the teacher is like, I'm not sure if I should show you this. You're right. You shouldn't. You shouldn't. Like this is a conversation you can maybe have.
You just don't.
Yeah. Like maybe after she graduates, like once like this teacher-student relationship dissolves, like that's chill and fine, but like for you to not recognize that, how fucking awkward that would be for her, like to not think about it.
Yeah, crossing some boundaries, dude.
And it all goes back to this idea that when there's this piece of media that we enjoy, we feel some sort of ownership over the people who create it. And that was that moment of like, oh, you made this thing that I enjoy, so I'm going to force now this interaction upon you. And so there was even like, she would opened up her locker and there were like notes in there that were very nice and thanking her. But it was just the idea that these people had put notes in her locker and she couldn't even grab her book without having this like foisted upon her. So I just loved all of the ways that it showed that there were bad interactions and there were trolls and there were people, you know, being very negative, but the people who were being positive were still maybe doing it not in the right time, place, and then just the overwhelming amount of feedback that she was getting in the comments and everything, and how that played on her as well. So it looked at every angle of fandom, the good, the bad, the ugly, and, you know, just the volume as well.
And I just thought it was interesting because there's that scene, because then that kind of spins out further, because it turns out that Wallace has gotten an offer to turn his fan fiction into a novelization of the graphic novel that she's creating. But he can't do that unless she finishes the graphic novel. Like the publisher has said, unless she comes out with the ending and everything gets wrapped up, we're not going to go ahead with this other project. So now she's literally being told by this guy that she likes and has been lying to, like, hey, this is a thing I really need you to do. And she can't, because she can't force herself to do that creative thing now that that wall has come down because her last coping mechanism has been cut off. So she can't bridge that gap anymore, but it's still that expectation that he has of her. And again, he's coming from that really nice place, and this is a really potentially awesome thing for him, but it's still... Like, I understood why, but when he was asking, it felt so inappropriate. Yeah. It just felt so intensely pressurized and inappropriate. And again, I think like you were saying, Mary, it had to do with like time and place and context, right? Like give it a minute, let some time go by or whatever. But just like in that moment, I was like, no, not Wallace, not right now.
I kind of appreciated the cringe. So like, I agree. Totally agree with everything that you're saying about like how it felt in that moment. I appreciated it because I think like Wallace was a little bit... I think this is like a smaller quibble, but I think Wallace was a little bit too idealized at points. Like there were levels at which he was slightly too understanding almost. I was like, I don't know. And like the way that whole thing at the end kind of played out, his initial like getting mad at her and all of that, I thought it was like, okay, like this checks out. Like, I think you're wrong. I think you're handling this incorrectly and like badly, but I also like, this is a very believable flaw for you to have. Like I buy that you are also like angry and coming at it. Like I understand the place that you're coming at this from, even though I think that you're clearly handling this terribly. And I don't know, it like Wallace became a fuller character to me for it.
I probably would have just needed, I know that they make up and he apologizes, but I wish there would have been more of an acknowledgement that was really messed up, that he put that kind of pressure on her to like make this thing because it would have benefited him. Like that moment was just so...
And at a time when he could kind of see her spinning out, like it's pretty clear to everyone by this point that she is not coping. And they'd already been fighting. And granted, I will say, Eliza does lie to... There are several opportunities that she has that she can tell him that there's this other part of her life. So like, I'm not saying that that's okay, but at the same time, like, he didn't handle his stuff well, almost kind of in what felt like retaliation. And like, I'm not here for that. Like, I'm not here for you trying to like kind of speak your truth, but also get back at me because you're still pissed. Like, if you're still pissed, you need to process that and deal with that. And then we can have a different conversation.
And I think the reason that it got so much to me was not because he was asking this or he was expecting it, but because she was saying that she couldn't for what were really clear, like, mental health reasons. Like, I cannot. And he was still like, but you're gonna. So that was the moment that I was like, Wallace, no. And I agree. It was very in character for him. And the reasons, you understood why he needed the money and wanting to go to college and all of the pressure that he had to go into a major that was, lucrative and all of that. So it was very in line with his character. I just would have wished that there was more of like a, hey, I realized that was not an okay thing to do. Like, I'm sorry. So that was a little bit missing for me, but it was fine.
I would agree. I mean, I love Wallace, but I think Wallace definitely takes a little bit of a backseat to Eliza in this book. And, he should. It's Eliza's book and it's Eliza's story. But even as his role as kind of her love interest / like secondary, like most important character, he just kind of, again, I don't know, like you were saying, if it was a little bit of that like idealization or just the fact that I felt like some of their conflict resolution happens because he's so terrified that Eliza is going to commit suicide that it at first it gut checks him into his own reactions, which is good. But then also like he's so afraid of that they both just kind of move on.
Right.
Yeah.
And that is a way to deal, and that is a coping mechanism. But kind of like you were saying, I would have appreciated it a lot more if there had been a little more like post that meeting on the hillside, like some discussion and broken down. Because after that happens, it kind of just wraps up and we get a little bit of hints of like how they're doing and that they're back together and like Wallace is at school and stuff. But like, I just didn't feel like it kind of got teased out as much, which I felt it because all the other parts of the book were so well handled and were so kind of nuanced in the way that they were handled that one I was a little like, actually, like, are we going to do that way? Like, is that all we're going to do with that?
I mentioned before that, like, I'm excited to kind of pick up on some dropped threads from the last episode in this one. And one of the things that struck me listening to the way that Sari talked about her like fandom participation as a means of developing like her own creative talents. And I mean, I guess, I don't know, I say Sari because she talked about a lot of like art and writing, but like my experience with it was also like, that's how I learned to build websites and stuff, like those like fan spaces as like personal growth creative spaces. And that was also something that I enjoyed. It was like a subtle piece of this. Like most of this story is about Eliza's like as a creator of this thing, but I liked the ways that she kind of keeps referring back to her experience in a fandom as like this really, really important formative experience, both in terms of like the kind of early sense of self that she was exploring as being this like fan of a thing, but also most importantly, the way in which that helped her come into her own as an artist and as a storyteller. And I just really enjoyed that piece of this as well.
Fun piece of meta side note, the Children of Hypnos books, which are the books within Eliza and Her Monsters that Eliza is super obsessed with, and those are like her fandom roots, you can actually read those. Francesca Zappia wrote like little abridged short story versions of the Children of Hypnos, and they're linked through her Goodreads page. So there's a fun little like
bonus
Rainbow
content.
Rowell doing fan fiction, but not like onward kind of overlap thing happening. So
that's very cool.
You mentioned fangirl, so I will bring this up now.
Do we have to? I don't want to.
Yeah, this is like fangirl, but better, first of all.
But the best.
But I think I was probably maybe one of two people by the sounds of it, Chelsea's the other one, who did not really enjoy fangirl. And then my least favorite parts of fangirl were all of the inserted fan fiction-y things, which then became Carry On, its own standalone book. But
which now has a sequel. I just don't understand what we're doing anymore. Rainbow, why is this happening?
I have no idea. I don't think it should be happening.
It's fine.
But I will say that while I really enjoyed the art in Eliza and Her Monsters and those little like things that we were looking at, I wasn't totally a fan of like the little inserts of story in this either. I think it's really difficult to do that gracefully and in a way that isn't super jarring to your story. And in a few places here, I would literally turn the page or keep reading and I was like, what? Wait, where are we? And we were suddenly in Monstrous Sea. So that was one thing that it was one of my quibbles where I was like, I appreciate getting to know more about what her art is and what her comic is about, but sometimes it wasn't handled very well.
That's fair. That's so interesting. I love that part. And
so did I. I was about to say.
I hated the fan fiction parts in Fangirl. I hated, maybe because like, I don't give a shit about vampire. Like the content itself was not interesting to me, but like, I'm very fascinated by this like Monstrous Sea webcomic and like what it's about. And I was like, I want that thing. Where's that thing? Give me that webcomic and I want it.
Yes, I completely agree. I also really enjoyed it. Like I enjoyed the comic. Wanted like similarly was like I would read this comic.
I would read this thing. I will be a fan. Give me this thing.
And I like really appreciated the fact that you had like the chat and the forum stuff because it felt so integral. Like because part of the point is that Eliza is living her life online, like that her life is taking place largely online. And so I really appreciated that we were also like seeing it as she was seeing it in places. So I don't know. I like this is your mileage may vary.
Yeah.
And I did not have that quibble.
I'm trying to think. I'm sure I had a quibble. Now I'm just trying to think of what it was.
No quibbles.
Like it's been just long enough that since I did my reread that I'm kind of like re-glossing over it again with that like 5-star shine of book in my brain. But like it is not a perfect book. So now I'm just trying to think of like what my big quibbles are.
I will say that I went through, as I do, the 1 and 2-star ratings on Goodreads because I was like, what? Why don't people like this?
Who hurt you, person?
Yeah. And a lot of it was like, Eliza is a brat and I don't like her kind of stuff, which is what, if you don't empathize with her, I get it. You're not going to like this book, but also, you're wrong, but it's fine.
Wrong, but whatever.
Stand there in your wrongness and be wrong. It's fine.
I think other portions of it where people couldn't suspend their disbelief, at least in terms of this being like a wildly super popular webcomic created by a teenager. which I found really weird. Yeah, I don't understand that line.
There's some other shit wrapped up in there, I think, a little bit. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I got some bad feels about that.
Yeah. Somebody's never met any major popular vlogger on YouTube.
Right.
Like,
That's
ever.
exactly what I thought. This whole like fiasco with Tana Mongeau is happening. Mongeau right now, and she's got millions.
Dude, I don't even. That is so far away from my corner of YouTube, but even I heard about it and I was like, what the fuck is this bitch doing? Thinking she can just like open up a hotel ballroom and call it a convention. Like, what is going on?
I don't even want to talk about her fiasco with TanaCon, but
I like tried to follow the hashtag a smidge and then I was like, this is too crazy even for me, dude.
I gotta go.
This is too far down the rabbit hole for me. I gotta go.
But you literally only need to go like that far into YouTube to see teenagers with millions of subscribers making money and full-time jobs off of this. So that idea that it's like a teenager made a wildly popular thing, I'm like,
excuse you? Well, because it's a teenage girl, right? Because it's all once it becomes out that it's Eliza, she starts getting some shit for that, right? That it's like because it's this teenage girl who's been creating it this whole time.
Yeah, and like that is also kind of baked into this larger conversation about like the way that we treat a lot of fanish activity too. That it is like things that are. It becomes, oh, this is less than because of the fact that we associate it with teenage girls and whatever. And I just, like, fuck you. This book is not for you. If that's your fundamental issue, I don't
know how to tell you how to like a book that's not for it's not for you.
Yeah,
right?
well, and it's not even just not for you. It's like there's a whole larger conversation about like culture and other people and like that I like we need to sit down and have. We need to have,
if we need to sit down and talk about like the legitimacy of teenage girls, like that's a different like cat like thing we can get into. It's a different can of worms to open later.
Like you're not,
I can't
like,
help you with that right now.
This is not you're not this is like the next level up. This is we need to like back to I don't know.
I think the thing because I've been thinking about it, and I think the thing that I think sticks out to me about I just don't love the way that the other relationships in the book were handled outside of Wallace and Eliza. And I just feel like it's because not quite enough attention is given to it on the page. And I just feel like maybe Francesca was trying to do a lot at the time. The stuff between her and Emmers and, whatever his name is, the guy, her two friends who help her like run there's clearly some like tension there. And you can tell that there's some like almost plot bunnies that are kind of dropped, but like they're never really explored. And I think that's to give us the impression that Eliza is so kind of self-obsessed and like wrapped up in her own drama that she's not paying attention, but it more comes across as like a little bit of lack of follow through.
Yes.
Or that like something maybe just kind of got a little bit forgotten, or like she had intended to start this like kind of story arc thing that didn't happen all the way. So that was probably like, now that I'm thinking back on it, because it happens again too with Wallace's friends, like she kind of sets up those relationships, but then we never really like she touches a little bit on the fallout, but we never really see how that evolves. So and you can't do everything in a book. So like it is what it is, but I just wish I had seen some of that, especially between her and her two best friends, kind of teased out a little bit more, because she is really shitty to them.
Yeah.
And she kind of apologizes, but also not.
Yeah. Yes.
So that's probably the one area where it fell down for me a little bit.
I really expected there to be something where the guy, is his name Max?
Yeah.
I think Max.
He confesses his love for Eliza, because there was that feeling like something was being teased out, and I was like, oh, what's happening? Something shady with his girlfriend Heather, who I thought was fake for a while, because just the way that she was mentioned, and that whole thing, there was definitely a feeling of like, oh, something's gonna happen here, and then it just kind of never does. So it definitely felt like a drop thread to me as well.
It's also frustrating too, I think. I don't know, it like not tremendously. It didn't ruin the book for me in any way, but like this whole idea of you have this YA story that has a, kind of a romance plot at the center of it, and the friends end up being relegated as a result of that focus. And for a book that did so many things to kind of twist your initial expectations, that like a thing that you thought was one thing was being explored in kind of a different and interesting way, that including that piece of it of like, we're only going to talk about this teenager's love interest and kind of her friends are just sort of there. That piece of it was like, oh, you got so close.
So close.
And I liked her friends. They seemed interesting. I just like, there just wasn't quite enough of them there. Back to the hashtag relatability of Eliza, the fact that they sent each other these care packages and stuff like that. Like that is also a thing that, I had friends even like dating back to high school that was a thing that you do with your online friends. Like here's some stuff. We don't actually hang out in person, but like we have like you create the sort of the semblance of physicality with stuff like that. There were things there with the friends that I really, really enjoyed, and I would have appreciated just a little bit more.
One other thing that I want to mention that I too enjoyed, it's brief, but I super appreciated it, was that after this whole like kind of journey of Eliza's mental health and what she's going through, is that we see a pretty positive interaction with a therapist at the end, and she just goes to therapy and she has a good session, and then like she takes what the therapist says and like internalizes it and like moves on from there, and it is super brief and it's not like a huge deal in the story, but I just really liked that her parents were like, you need to go see someone. She goes to see someone and it's a positive interaction, because that is so rare in fiction to have that kind of thing go on. And even her saying like, I didn't mean to say in real life, I don't mean to like invalidate you or your friendships or whatnot. So that whole one little scene was something that the whole time I was reading it, I was like, yay.
And I love the way that Francesca did it, because it's just dropped in. Like there's no scene where we see Eliza going and meeting her therapist. It just starts and he's like talking to her and she's talking back, and like it's never, you kind of have to suss it out from like the dialogue that she's actually like, this is a therapist that she's talking to now. But I love that because it's just jarring enough to kind of make you to pull you into this is a new thing that she's doing and a new thing that she's trying. And plus her therapist sounds rad. Like he actually gives some like good advice about like centering yourself and all of that, just like good therapy stuff. It reminded me of all the good sessions that I've had. And you're right, we so often see therapy as like either not a thing or like a very hard, stressful, negative thing, which like it can be very difficult, but at the same time it can also be really helpful and not and just a thing that you need to do. So I love that part.
I think it was also just really important to have in this YA novel that is very much about a teenager's mental health struggles to include. Like that was just like a very important thing to do. And the fact that it was done without it feeling like here's the big, morality. I, the author, will, preach at you about this thing. Like just it was like important and necessary to include it, and very, very well handled. So that didn't feel, I don't know, like preachy. It felt very honest and good.
I really like the message too about creating art. I mean, this also tackles that whole idea of like the starving artist or like the sad artist or being in your depression to create your art and those kinds of things that are peddled by tropes and media and stuff, and just the advice
by
of
people who don't have mental illness, by people who have never been asked to create while in the depths of like, that's one of my little like soapbox things where I'm like, those who say one must suffer for art have never truly like suffered and then be asked to create art.
And they talk about that idea of like having an empty well and nothing to give or nothing to really draw on, and just the way that they talk about like, do you want to finish this? If the answer is yes, then there are ways to work through it. But if the answer is no, if you don't want to create this, you don't have to force yourself. So that whole idea of like being healthy and creating your art from a healthy place, I love that. I really love that.
Because it shows that negative side of creation too, right? Of that almost like obsessive, or like when we compelled to keep doing a thing that started out from a place of joy that no longer brings us joy for a whole host of like various reasons, some incredibly important and serious and legitimate, and some just all up in our own heads. There's a lot of, I thought, really interesting stuff where Eliza talks about when she's first trying to start getting back into drawing after taking this like mental health break. she feels so paralyzed by doing it because she's afraid she's going to do it wrong again. She's afraid she's going to have forgotten how to do this thing that she knows how to do. And that fear of starting again in so many ways can be so paralyzing and so afraid, can be so terrifying and can make us so afraid that we just don't do it. And so I think the fact that Eliza does start again and we see kind of how she starts getting back into that process is also a really helpful part of that equation.
And also the fact that, she says to Wallace, like, I can't do this. And like that is, I think, like, it's easy to read that as like, oh, the creative inspiration just hasn't struck. And like, that's why I can't, I like that it is very clearly and explicitly like, I can't because of my mental health, and that is often a thing that you just reach a place where you can't do anything, and like Eliza is very clearly in that place, and you see it beyond just, it's not just that she can't create this, she just like can't function. She reaches a point where she cannot function, period. And so there is something that is totally above and beyond like the comic creation going on with her. And I like that was explored as thoroughly and thoughtfully as it was.
Which is part of why I get so frustrated with Wallace in that scene when he asks, because like Wallace has had mental health struggles too, right? Like he's also coming from that really negative place. So one kind of struggling person to another, she kind of expects him to have a little more sympathy, and he just doesn't. And because his mental health is processed differently and his creativity helped him in a way that is different for Eliza, he just doesn't understand, like, why can't you just draw? Like, it's just drawing. It's just lines on a page. Why can't you just do it? Just do it. And she can't, because like you were saying, Sweeney, there's so many other layers that are shutting down her ability to do that. It's not just the creating. It's like all that other shit that she's also trying to process. But that's just, you want him to have that sympathy for her because he's been there, and then he just doesn't.
God damn it, Wallace.
Damn it, Wallace.
God damn it, Wallace. Because also, like, I really, like, I want to, like, he's not as good as Eliza, but like, I do really love Wallace. I love this big, long-haired, like, guy who writes on paper because he won't talk in public, and who, like, lives in the basement and writes fan fiction. And like, there are a lot of parts about Wallace that I like, but there are just a lot of parts where I'm like, in a book that's so full of like sunbursts of awesome, I'm just like, come on, man. Be better. Be a little bit better.
I think, I don't know that it's even a question of having Wallace be a little bit better, but back to Mari's earlier point about just having the book be a little bit clearer about the fact that Wallace is being shitty. Like, there is an apology and it's there.
That's fair.
I think the book perspective definitely is that Wallace is being shitty, but I don't know that the book perspective goes as far as it should on that point. And I think, that is more what I would have liked to have seen, is a little bit more clarity on the degree to which Wallace was being shitty at the end.
No, and I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's fair. It's just not, it's in there. It's just not as kind of highlighted in neon to take as a takeaway point as I wish that it was.
I'm just like looking over my notes. I think we talked about everything. I literally wrote down, I loved the mixed in art and forum stuff.
I like the art, okay? It was just like the little pieces of the story where it was like, what are we reading now?
and to be fair, like, I get like, I think if I had like not quite liked the actual bits of story quite as much as I did, they are kind of jarring, right? Like they are just kind of like stuck in there. There's not really like any way to like transition to them. So like, especially because they are drawing and they're not always like text stuff. I don't know. I liked the IM format. I just like the formatting of this book. I think that helped make it with the readability, like you were saying. I think the fact that a lot of it is in like instant message conversation or is part of those like comic panel drawings, that helps move it along a little bit like quicker.
I was initially like confused and frustrated that I couldn't find an audiobook of it until I opened it, and I was like, oh, right, I get it.
Can't listen.
And I think that will do it for this episode of Snark Squad Pod. If you would like to share your thoughts about Eliza and her monsters or anything else from this episode, you can find us on SnarkSquad.com, where there will also be a list of all of the stuff that we're going to be watching or reading, whatever, in the future. You can also sign up for our newsletter and join our Discord and all of that fun stuff. You can find us on Twitter at @Snark_Squad. You can find me at Sweeney Says.
I am at My Name is Marines.
And you can find me on Twitter at An Outlaw Life and at my website, chelseaoutlaw.com.
Thank you to Chelsea for joining us again this week, and to Stefan Chin for the snazzy outro music that is playing us out right now. And we will be back again next week. Bye.
Bye.